The very last thing that we want to discuss in this section of international trade is tariffs and quotas. I've got the word quota there twice. Tariffs and quotas. So tariff fundamentally are a tax on imports, right? It's when the government imposes a tax on imports. This used to be a very, very important way that the federal government was funded, right? In prior to the 20th century, tariffs made up a very substantial portion of federal revenue. Less so in recent years, though, since the President Trump took office in 2017, the use of tariffs and the threat of tariffs has clearly increased over the last few decades. We also can talk about quotas. And so from an economic perspective, we can incorporate what tariffs and quotas look like in a basic market, right? So we can consider a market similar to what we've done before of this is domestic demand, this is domestic supply, and we've got, again, the closed economy, domestic world equilibrium price. This is what prices would be if we had a completely closed economy and we didn't do any trade. And then we've got the lower world price. And so is this a question of when we're importing or exporting? This is a story of when we are importing from other countries, right? And so if we've got the lower world prices, then we've got, this is the quantity supplied domestically. This is how much our domestic producers are going to produce. And this is how much domestic consumers are going to want to buy. And right, so that means that again, we can do this in, let's go ahead and do red for, these are the number of units that are produced by our domestic producers. And then in blue, we can do, these are the number of units that our domestic consumers want to buy. Normally, we'd call this what? A market shortage, and there would be upward pressure on prices, but our domestic consumers are able to buy all of these goods from other countries by importing them, right? But again, we talked about how that can make our domestic producers worse off. And when people lose their job because of competition from lower cost foreign competition, sometimes there's a political move to try to help our domestic producers. And so one way that we can help our domestic producers is by taxing foreign goods. What taxing foreign goods does is it raises the domestic price of goods and services, right? If you put a tax on a good, it becomes more expensive. And so we've got some data to suggest that there's going to be an increase in the price of some goods if some of the proposed tariffs go into full effect, right? And the degree to which prices go up are going to be a function of elasticity in this model. It's also going to depend on some other things that are beyond what we're doing in this class. But in general, right, tariffs make goods more expensive. When goods become more expensive, it means that our domestic producers are going to be able to charge higher prices, and we're going to see, right, what we used to highlight this as the gains from trade, that big green triangle was the gains from trade, specifically the gains from importing for foreign countries. We're going to see producer surplus start inching up, right? If our producers can get higher prices, then our producers are going to gain this amount right here. But notice that it comes at the expense of what used to belong to consumers. And so that area right there, yes, our domestic producers will be better off, but our domestic consumers will be worse off. That area right there is the redistribution of economic value. That's not so much interesting. If we have high prices, it looks like there's still a degree of importing, and so we still have gains from trade. They're just smaller than they otherwise would be, right? And so these other regions, right, this looks like economic value that used to be there when we had an open economy and traded with everyone. And now when we impose some tariffs, that's economic value that might be going away. We might want to call that a deadweight loss, right? Specifically, I want to highlight two little areas. There's this little area right here, and there's this little area right here. I'm going to call those areas, these are deadweight loss from tariffs, right? There is a deadweight loss. There is an economic inefficiency relative to an open market that we're going to see from a tariff. Tariffs create a deadweight loss. Any kind of tax is going to create a deadweight loss. There's a deadweight loss that's created here. The difference is there's this little area right here. And so this little area right here, what is that? So it's a little rectangle. The base of that rectangle represents the amount of tariffs, right? We're still not the amount of tariffs, but the amount of imports. We're still importing goods from foreign countries, even though they become more expensive. That doesn't mean that we make all of our imports go to zero, right? It just means there's less imports than there were before. And then the height of this rectangle is the size of the tariff. And so what we're going to call that in purple, let's go ahead and call that the tariff revenue. This is tariff revenue. It's revenue that, again, goes to the government. Right? So this is tariff revenue. It used to come from who, though? That economic value used to belong to consumers. Now it goes to producers. It used to be part of the gains from trade. Now it's not lost. It's just redistributed to the government. So this is the general concept of what goes on with tariffs, right? Tariffs reduce our gains from trade. Tariffs create a deadweight loss. Tariffs make goods more expensive for our domestic consumers, but it does help our domestic producers. On the right, we've got quotas. What's a quota? A quota is when the government doesn't put a tax on a good, but rather it just restricts the amount that can come in, right? So we've got, if instead of just adding a 5% tariff on goods from Mexico, if they instead said we're going to allow X number of automobiles from Mexico or X number of avocados from Mexico, right? If instead of influencing the price, if instead we try to influence the quantity, that's what a quota does. So a quota is an artificial restriction on the supply in a market. Hey, whenever we reduce supply, similar to on the left with tariffs, it's going to drive up prices, right? If we artificially restrict the amount that can come in, anytime that we artificially restrict supply, it's going to make goods more expensive. So we still have the same story as we did on the left, where quotas, by restricting how much can come in from foreign markets, it's going to make our domestic producers better off, but it comes at the expense of our domestic consumers, right? There is a gain from producer surplus, but it comes at the expense of the consumer surplus. That's, again, just a redistribution of value. The more important thing is that, again, we had this entire area was gains from trade from importing when we have a free and big free open economy with international trade. Now, if we restrict the amount that can come in, not to zero, right? We still, in this model, we're still allowing some level of imports. So that quota is setting a restricted but not a complete ban on the amount of goods that can come from other countries. We still have gains from trade. They're just smaller from before. And the difference is that now this entire area down here, all three of those triangles are now a deadweight loss. That's a deadweight loss from a quota, right? And so again, can you succinctly describe what's the difference in the welfare outcomes for consumers, producers, the gains from trade, the deadweight loss, and any kind of revenue for the government? What's the impact on welfare outcomes for a tariff compared to a quota? How would you compare tariffs and quotas in terms of their different welfare outcomes?